Let me ask you a question that seems absurd on its surface. If you were a prisoner of war, locked behind barbed wire, guarded 24 hours a day, forbidden from leaving, would you ever, under any circumstances, beg your captors not to release you? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? The entire concept of imprisonment is built on the assumption that freedom is what everyone wants. That's why we use captivity as punishment. That's why escape is celebrated in literature and film. That's why liberation is always portrayed as joyous, triumphant, the end of suffering. But history is full of moments that shatter our assumptions, that turn our certainties upside down, and force us to reconsider what we think we know about human nature. And this is one of them, perhaps one of the most profound and disturbing paradoxes to emerge from the Second World War. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. Most people don't know this. The camps have been largely forgotten, erased from collective memory. Their locations returned to farmland or suburban development. Among these prisoners were thousands of women, young women mostly, who had served in auxiliary roles for Nazi Germany's military machine. They were radio operators, communications specialists, anti-aircraft assistants, nurses, administrators. They had been captured across Europe as the Wehrmacht collapsed, swept up in the chaos of Germany's defeat. And when the war ended, when American officers stood before these women in camps scattered across Texas, Iowa, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and announced, "You're free to go home," something unprecedented happened, something that shocked the officers, confused military brass, and revealed a truth about war that no one wanted to acknowledge. They cried, they pleaded, they wrote formal petitions in careful handwriting. Some fell to their knees in the dust, not in joy, in terror. Today, I want to explore this paradox with you. Not just what happened, but why it happened, what it reveals about human psychology, about the true nature of freedom, and about the costs of war that no one talks about in history books or commemoration ceremonies. This isn't just a history lesson, an interesting anecdote from the past. It's a case study in how catastrophic conditions can flip our most basic assumptions upside down. It's about understanding that freedom and captivity aren't always opposites. Sometimes they're points on a spectrum, and sometimes, paradoxically, chains can feel safer than liberty. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why rational, intelligent human beings could genuinely fear freedom more than imprisonment. And that understanding might change how you think about freedom itself, about what we owe to refugees and displaced persons, about the nature of home and security, and what it means to be truly free. Picture this scene in vivid detail. It's May 10th, 1945. Just 2 days after Victory in Europe Day, when the surrender documents have barely been signed, when the world is still reeling from 6 years of total war. Camp Como, Texas. The sun is already fierce at mid-morning, the kind of heat that shimmers off the dusty ground. Inside a compound surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire, 43 German women stand in formation. They're wearing standardized work uniforms, modified from Wehrmacht auxiliary service dress, practical gray-green garments that have faded from months of washing. Their faces are weathered from outdoor work, their hands calloused from field labor. Some are as young as 19. The oldest is 41. They stand at attention, not because they're required to maintain military discipline. The Americans don't care about that, but because it's habit, and because the formality helps them cope with uncertainty. Captain William Henderson approaches the formation. At 34 years old, Henderson has been running this camp for 8 months. He's a practical man, a former high school principal from a small town in Ohio who got called up for service but couldn't deploy overseas due to a heart murmur discovered during his physical exam. Running a POW camp wasn't his first choice. He'd wanted to join the fight, to be part of the great crusade against fascism. Instead, he found himself managing enemy prisoners in rural Texas, which felt anticlimactic, even shameful at first. But he takes the job seriously. He's read the Geneva Convention regulations cover to cover. He's instituted a system that's firm but fair. He's even learned a few words of German, though he murders the pronunciation. Today, he's prepared a short speech. He's even practiced it in front of his wife last night, who told him it sounded appropriate and kind. This is supposed to be good news, after all. The culmination of everything they've been working toward. The end of the war. The return to normalcy. Ladies, he begins, and he means it, despite their enemy status, despite the fact that these women served the military of a nation that allied with Japan and brought America into the war. He's made a point of maintaining basic courtesy. His mother raised him to be polite to women. And even war and uniforms and barbed wire don't change that fundamental sense of decency. The war is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich has ceased to exist. In the coming weeks, you will be processed for repatriation. Ships are being prepared. Transport schedules are being arranged. You're going home. He expects something as he says these words. Relief, maybe. Gratitude. Perhaps even celebration, albeit subdued celebration given their circumstances. He's seen newsreels of liberated American POWs, the joy on their faces, the tears of happiness. He expects a mirror image of that, even if more muted. What he gets instead is silence. Heavy, suffocating silence that seems to press down on the dusty ground like physical weight. The women don't move. They don't look at each other. They stare straight ahead, their faces frozen in expressions Henderson can't quite read. Then a woman in the front row, Henderson knows her as prisoner 2847, though her name is Maria Schneider, begins to cry. Not quiet tears, not dignified sorrow. Deep, body-shaking sobs that make her shoulders heave and her breath come in gasps. It's the sound of someone whose world has just ended, not begun anew. Within seconds, it spreads like contagion through the formation. Women throughout the ranks are weeping. Some clutch each other, breaking formation, no longer caring about discipline or propriety. One woman, a young blonde-haired auxiliary who can't be more than 22, sinks to her knees in the dust, her hands covering her face. Henderson is bewildered. He feels his prepared speech dying in his throat, the words suddenly meaningless. He looks to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Morris, a 19-year-old kid from Nebraska, who looks equally confused and slightly terrified by this display of raw emotion. Morris shrugs helplessly. This wasn't in their training. Nothing prepared them for prisoners who don't want to be freed. An older prisoner, one of the few who speaks decent English, steps forward. Her name is Frau Schmidt. The women call her that, using the formal German address, because at 41 she's significantly older than most prisoners here, and they treat her with a respect that transcends their official status. She was a schoolteacher before the war, a woman of education and bearing who somehow ended up in a Wehrmacht administrative office and then in an American POW camp. Captain Henderson, she says, her English careful and precise, each word enunciated with the clarity of someone who learned the language from books rather than conversation. You must understand. For us, this is not liberation. This is, how do I say, a death sentence. Henderson stares at her, genuinely uncomprehending. I don't understand. You're being freed, released. You can return to your families, to your homes, to your lives. The words sound hollow even as he speaks them, though he doesn't yet understand why. Frau Schmidt responds quietly, her voice steady, despite the chaos of weeping women around her. We have no families to return to. We have no homes. Germany is rubble from one end to the other. Our cities are destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. Our parents are dead or missing. If we go to the Soviet zone, we will be arrested immediately, possibly executed, almost certainly deported to labor camps in Siberia. If we go to the Western zones controlled by your forces, we will starve. We will have no shelter. We will have nothing. Here, at least, we eat every day. Here, at least, we are safe. Here, at least, we can sleep without fear of violence. She pauses, and her voice drops to something barely above a whisper, but the words carry clearly in the hot Texas air. Then she adds something that will stay with Henderson for the rest of his life, that will haunt his dreams and his waking thoughts, that will make him question everything he thought he knew about freedom and imprisonment, and what it means to liberate someone. Captain, please understand. We do not wish to be your prisoners. We do not enjoy captivity, but we wish even less to be free in Germany. Can you understand this? Can you comprehend what we are saying? Now, let's pause here and analyze what's actually happening in this moment, because this scene reveals something profound about human psychology, about social collapse, about the nature of freedom itself. First principle that we need to establish. Freedom is not an absolute good. It's conditional on circumstances. We tend to think of freedom as universally desirable, as the highest human aspiration, as something that everyone always wants. But that's a dangerous oversimplification, one that ignores the material conditions that make freedom valuable. What humans actually need is not freedom in the abstract, but the conditions that make life sustainable. Psychologist Abraham Maslow understood this when he created his hierarchy of needs pyramid in 1943. Ironically, the same year many of these women were being recruited into Wehrmacht service. Before we can value abstract concepts like freedom, belonging, self-actualization, we need basic physiological and safety needs met. We need food. We need water. We need shelter. We need protection from violence. Without these foundations, freedom becomes meaningless, or worse, it becomes a burden, a source of terror rather than joy. These women were facing a stark choice between two options, and neither was good. Option A, legal freedom with no food security, no shelter, no physical safety, no functioning social support systems. Option B, legal captivity with guaranteed food intake, adequate shelter, physical safety, medical care, and at least the framework of a functioning micro-society. When framed that way, when you strip away the abstractions and look at the concrete reality, the choice becomes less paradoxical. They weren't crazy. They weren't Stockholm Syndrome victims who had fallen in love with their captors. They were rational actors making the best decision available to them given impossible circumstances. They were choosing survival over status, substance over symbolism, reality over ideology. Second principle. Home is not a place. It's a system of survival. This is crucial to understanding their terror. When we say going home, we don't just mean returning to a physical location, to a specific building on a specific street in a specific city. We mean returning to a social system that supports life. We mean family networks that provide emotional and economic support. We mean economic structures that offer opportunities for employment and sustenance. We mean housing that protects from the elements. We mean food distribution systems that prevent starvation. We mean healthcare infrastructure that treats illness. We mean social services that catch people when they fall. We mean all the invisible infrastructure of civilization that we take for granted until it disappears. Germany in 1945 had none of that. The entire system had collapsed completely. It wasn't damaged, it was gone. Home, in any meaningful sense, didn't exist anymore. The buildings were rubble. The family networks were dead or scattered. The economic structures were destroyed. The food distribution had failed. The healthcare system had collapsed. There was nothing to return to except chaos and death. So when Captain Henderson said, "You're going home," what these women heard was, "You're being expelled from the last functioning social system available to you and sent into chaos where your survival is questionable at best." That's not liberation. That's abandonment. That's a death sentence delivered with good intentions and patriotic sentiment, but a death sentence nonetheless. Third principle, captivity can function as a form of social contract. Think about what these POW camps actually provided. Beyond the symbolism of barbed wire and guards, They provided guaranteed caloric intake of approximately 300 calories per day, according to detailed Red Cross inspection reports. They provided shelter with heating systems for winter months. They provided medical care with professional doctors and actual medicine. They provided sanitation facilities with hot water and soap. They provided predictable routine that allowed for psychological stability. They provided physical security with guards who, ironically, protected prisoners from potential violence. They provided social community with other women in similar situations, allowing for mutual support and solidarity. This isn't slavery or torture or deliberate cruelty. This is actually a basic social safety net, functioning more effectively than many civilian systems at the time. Yes, the barbed wire is there. Yes, the guards watch them. Yes, they're not free to leave. But within that framework of restriction, these women had something approaching stability, something approaching normal life. They woke at regular times. They ate regular meals. They worked regular hours at jobs that, while hard, were not deadly. They had leisure time in the evenings. They could write letters, play music, create art, form friendships. In Germany, they would have none of these things. In Germany, they'd be free but unable to access any social safety net because those systems had been destroyed by 6 years of total war. This is the paradox that Captain Henderson couldn't initially comprehend. The prison provided what the free society could not. The captivity offered more genuine human dignity than liberation would. Before we go deeper into the historical details, into the stories of individual women and their experiences, I want to emphasize why this story is relevant right now, in our present moment, not just as historical curiosity. We live in a time of massive displacement that rivals the post-World War II period. Climate refugees fleeing rising seas and failing agriculture. War refugees escaping Syria, Ukraine, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Yemen. Economic migrants leaving collapsed economies in Venezuela, Lebanon, Zimbabwe. Millions upon millions of people are fleeing their homes, trying desperately to reach places with functioning social systems. And often they end up in detention centers, refugee camps, immigration facilities, controlled environments that restrict freedom of movement. From the outside, from the perspective of those of us who live in stable societies with functioning infrastructure, we see only the restriction of freedom. We see barbed wire and guards and controlled movement. We criticize these facilities as cruel, inhumane, unacceptable. And often they are poorly run, underfunded, mismanaged. But from the inside, from the perspective of the people who've fled failed states and war zones, these facilities often represent the only place offering basic security. The only place where they can be relatively certain of their physical safety, where they'll eat today, where their children won't be recruited by militias or killed by stray bullets. The German women POWs in America were experiencing an extreme version of a dynamic that still plays out every single day in 2025, when social systems collapse, when states fail, when war destroys the infrastructure of civilization. People will accept restrictions on freedom in exchange for basic survival needs. They'll choose the detention center over the war zone. They'll choose the refugee camp over starvation in a collapsed economy. They'll choose restriction with security over freedom with terror. Understanding this historical case helps us understand current refugee crises. It helps us understand why people risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean or the Rio Grande. It helps us understand why they make choices that seem irrational from the outside. Why don't they just stay home and fix their own country, but are perfectly logical from the inside? Because home doesn't exist anymore in any meaningful sense. Because fixing a collapsed society is beyond individual capability. Because sometimes the only rational choice is to leave, to seek safety wherever it can be found, even if that safety comes with restrictions and indignities. Now let's go back and understand how these women ended up in this impossible situation in the first place. Let's understand who they were, what they did, how they came to be prisoners in rural America. Here's something most people don't know about World War II. something that gets left out of standard histories and textbooks. Nazi Germany mobilized over 500,000 women into uniformed military auxiliary roles. Let me repeat that, because it's worth emphasizing. 500,000 women in military service. That's more women than currently serve in the entire United States military today in 2025. These weren't factory workers contributing to the war effort from civilian positions. These weren't nurses working in civilian hospitals. These were women who were integrated directly into the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, performing essential military functions, wearing uniforms, living on or near military installations, subject to military discipline and military law. Let me be absolutely clear about why this is historically significant and why it contradicts everything we think we know about Nazi society. It completely contradicts the Nazi propaganda image of women's role in society. Nazi ideology officially promoted a very specific concept that was repeated endlessly in propaganda. Kinder, Küche, Kirche. Children, kitchen, church. Women were supposed to be mothers first and foremost, homemakers who nurtured the next generation of German men, keepers of traditional domestic virtues. They were explicitly not supposed to be in public life, in politics, in military service. Hitler himself said in a speech on September 13, 1936, "Germany will not form any section of women grenade throwers or any corps of women elite snipers. That is not equality for women, but rather diminishment of women. For what is truly a woman's nature is to be a companion and to be a mother." So how did 500,000 women end up in military roles when Nazi ideology explicitly forbade it? How did this massive contradiction between propaganda and practice develop? The answer reveals something important about totalitarian regimes. Pragmatism always trumps ideology when survival is at stake. As the war consumed more and more German men, dead on battlefields across Europe, Africa, and Russia, wounded and unable to serve, captured by the Allies or tied down in occupation duties, the military faced a critical and growing shortage of personnel for essential support roles. Communications, administration, logistics, air defense, all these functions needed trained personnel, and there simply weren't enough men to fill these positions while also maintaining combat strength at the front. By 1943, the crisis was acute. The Wehrmacht needed hundreds of thousands of additional support personnel, and the only untapped labor pool was women. The Nazis solved this ideological problem through semantic manipulation and linguistic gymnastics. Women weren't called soldiers. They were auxiliaries, or Helferinnen, helpers. They didn't serve in the military in the official sense. They assisted military operations. They weren't given military ranks comparable to male soldiers. They had equivalent grades that technically kept them in a separate category. This linguistic fiction allowed the Nazi regime to maintain ideological purity in propaganda and public statements while practically militarizing hundreds of thousands of women to fill critical manpower shortages. Let me break down what these women actually did in their military roles, because the details matter enormously for understanding who they were and how they ended up in American captivity. The Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen, the Air Force Communications Auxiliaries, formed the largest single group. By 1944, over 200,000 women worked in Luftwaffe communications across occupied Europe and within Germany itself. These women operated sophisticated radio equipment, listening to Allied communications and transmitting German orders. They worked telegraph systems that connected far-flung military units. They operated encryption machines, including the famous Enigma device that the Allies were secretly breaking at Bletchley Park. They staffed telephone switchboards that routed calls between headquarters and field units. They operated weather observation equipment that provided crucial data for air operations. These weren't peripheral roles that anyone could do with minimal training. Modern warfare depends absolutely on communications. Without reliable, secure communications, no military force can function effectively. A tank without radio contact is just an isolated piece of metal. An aircraft without communication to ground control is flying blind. An infantry unit without ability to call for support is doomed. These women were the nervous system of the Luftwaffe. Without them, German air operations would have been impossible. The Flakhelferinnen, the anti-aircraft auxiliaries, formed another huge category. By late 1944, as the Allied strategic bombing campaign intensified and German cities were being systematically destroyed, 160,000 women served in air defense roles across the Reich. Now, Nazi ideology drew a line at having women actually fire the guns. That remained exclusively a male role, the last bastion of traditional masculine military duty. But women did literally everything else in the flak batteries. They operated the acoustic listening devices that detected incoming bomber formations before they could be seen. They ran the massive searchlights that illuminated targets for the gun crews in night attacks. They operated the mechanical computers, analog calculating machines that computed firing solutions based on aircraft speed, altitude, and trajectory. They maintained all the equipment, cleaning mechanisms, replacing parts, ensuring everything functioned when needed. They loaded ammunition, hauling heavy shells and preparing them for firing. When Allied bombers attacked German cities, these young women were on the front lines of home defense, exposed to exactly the same dangers as male soldiers. They died in air raids with depressing regularity. A bomb doesn't care whether you're male or female, soldier or auxiliary. The Allies were bombing military installations, and these women were at military installations, so they died alongside the men they worked with. The Wehrmacht's Helferinnen, army auxiliaries, filled countless essential roles that kept the Wehrmacht functioning. They staffed military administration offices, maintaining the enormous bureaucracy that any modern army requires. They worked in logistics and supply operations, tracking the movement of materiel from factories to front lines. They drove vehicles, transporting officers, carrying supplies, evacuating wounded. They provided medical support in field hospitals and aid stations. They worked in food services, preparing meals for thousands of troops. Then there were the nurses, the DRK members. Over 400,000 women serving with the German Red Cross. But here's what most people don't realize. The German Red Cross, during the Nazi period, was not the neutral humanitarian organization we imagine when we hear Red Cross. The DRK had been thoroughly Nazified, taken over by the regime, and made into an instrument of state policy. All nurses swore personal loyalty oaths to Adolf Hitler himself. They served in field hospitals that followed Wehrmacht units into occupied territories: Poland, France, the Soviet Union, the Balkans. They treated wounded German soldiers, yes, but they also operated within a military system that routinely violated the Geneva Convention and committed atrocities. They weren't directly committing war crimes, but they were part of the machinery that enabled them. Now, here's what's critically important to understand about who these women were, psychologically, socially, and culturally. They were young. The average age of female auxiliaries ranged from 22 to 26 years old. Many were even younger, teenagers when they first entered service, 17 or 18 years old. Think about what that means. These women reached adulthood entirely within the Nazi system. They had no adult memories of the Weimar Republic, no experience of democratic society, no framework for comparison. The totalitarian state was all they'd ever known as adults. They were educated, which distinguished them from the general male conscript population. Unlike male soldiers who were drawn from all social classes, including peasants and workers who might have minimal education, female auxiliaries were predominantly middle class, with at least secondary education. Many had completed gymnasium, the German equivalent of high school. The roles they filled required literacy, the ability to follow complex technical instructions, often skills in multiple languages, and the capacity to learn specialized technical tasks. You couldn't put an illiterate peasant girl on an Enigma machine or teach her to compute firing solutions. These positions required educated, intelligent young women, They were indoctrinated from childhood. Most of these women had been members of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, which was the female branch of the Hitler Youth Organization. This wasn't optional. After 1936, membership was mandatory for all German girls. They'd spent their formative years in an organization that taught Nazi ideology as fundamental truth, that organized their social lives around regime priorities, that shaped their understanding of themselves and their role in society. They learned that their purpose was to serve the Volk, the racial community. They learned that individual concerns were subordinate to collective needs. They learned that questioning authority was betrayal. They learned that the Führer was infallible and that Germany was engaged in an existential struggle for survival. This wasn't subtle propaganda. It was comprehensive indoctrination from ages 10 to 18, during the most psychologically formative years of human development. But here's the crucial nuance. And this is where we need to be careful and honest. They were not fanatics. This distinction is absolutely critical for understanding their later behavior in American camps and their desperate desire to remain prisoners. Most of these women weren't ideological true believers in the way that SS officers or Nazi party leaders were. They hadn't joined the party early out of genuine conviction. They hadn't volunteered for auxiliary service because they had a burning desire to advance Nazi ideology. They were products of a totalitarian society who had internalized that society's norms and values through constant exposure and social pressure, without necessarily understanding the evil at the system's core. They had normalized abnormality. They had accepted monstrous policies as simply how things were done. They had compartmentalized, telling themselves that their specific role was harmless, even as the larger system committed unprecedented crimes. This brings us to a difficult question that we need to address directly and honestly. Were these women victims or perpetrators? The honest answer, uncomfortable as it is both, and neither. It's complicated, and history is almost always more complicated than we want it to be. They weren't SS concentration camp guards like Irma Grace or Ilse Koch, women who directly participated in atrocities and took sadistic pleasure in cruelty. They didn't participate in mass shootings or medical experiments or the Holocaust's industrial murder. They weren't war criminals in any legal sense that would stand up in court. But they also weren't innocent. They weren't passive victims swept up by forces beyond their control. They enabled the German war machine through their labor. They were the administrative and technical infrastructure that allowed Wehrmacht operations to continue. They were the communications network that transmitted orders. They were the logistics system that moved supplies. They were the medical system that patched up soldiers and sent them back to kill more Allied troops and commit more atrocities in occupied territories. Here's how I think about their moral status, their degree of guilt or innocence. They existed in that vast gray zone that war creates, that space between the clearly guilty perpetrators and the clearly innocent victims. They were complicit in a monstrous system without being individually guilty of its worst crimes. They bear some degree of moral responsibility for their participation, but that responsibility is dramatically less than those who planned and executed the Holocaust or who personally committed atrocities. Most didn't choose to serve out of sadistic impulses or deep ideological fanaticism. They served for much more mundane reasons. They were raised in a totalitarian system that made military service seem normal, patriotic, even noble. Social pressure to conform was immense, and refusing could bring serious consequences, including social ostracism, loss of employment, even arrest in some cases. After 1943, many were drafted through the Kriegshilfsdienst, the auxiliary war service obligation, so it wasn't even voluntary anymore. And they genuinely believed, or convinced themselves to believe, through psychological defense mechanisms, that they were defending their homeland against enemies who wanted to destroy Germany. This doesn't excuse their participation. Understanding is not excusing, but it does help explain the psychology we'll see later. The profound guilt, the crushing shame, the complex and troubled relationship with their past. It helps explain why so many of them never talked about their war service to their children and grandchildren, why they buried those years and tried to forget. So how did these women end up in American captivity thousands of miles from home? As Allied forces advanced through Europe in 1944 and 1945, as the Wehrmacht was pushed back on all fronts, units were captured, retreated in disorder, or surrendered en masse. Women serving with these units became prisoners of war just like male soldiers. The Geneva Convention made no distinction. Enemy military personnel, regardless of gender, were to be taken prisoner. Some specific scenarios illustrate how this happened. In North Africa, women serving with communications units supporting Rommel's Africa Corps were captured by British and American forces in 1942 and 1943 as the Germans were defeated at El Alamein and driven from the continent. In France, after D-Day on June 6, 1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and pushed across France toward Germany, women in communication centers, administrative offices, and logistics units were swept up in mass surrenders. Some tried to flee east toward Germany ahead of the Allied advance, but many were caught in the rapid encirclement operations that trapped entire German divisions. In Germany itself, during the final collapse of April and May 1945, entire units surrendered as the Reich disintegrated. Women attached to these units as auxiliaries became prisoners automatically. Initially, most captured German women were held in camps in Europe, in Britain, France, and occupied Germany itself. But as British facilities became overcrowded and the Americans wanted to relieve the burden on their allies, many prisoners were transferred to the United States. This wasn't unusual. By 1945, the U.S. was holding over 400,000 German and Italian POWs on American soil. Now imagine being these women in mid-1945. Really try to put yourself in their mental state. You've served in what you believed, or told yourself you believed, was a defensive war. You've watched your country lose catastrophically. You've seen cities you knew destroyed by bombing raids. You've lost friends and family members. You're physically and emotionally exhausted. You're likely malnourished from the declining rations of the war's final years. You're traumatized by what you've witnessed. And now, you're being loaded onto a ship bound for America, a place you've been taught to fear your entire life. You've been raised on propaganda depicting Americans as savage, brutal enemies. You've seen propaganda films showing Americans as gangsters, as culturally inferior, as racially mixed, and therefore degenerate in Nazi racial theory. You've been told that capture by Americans means certain torture, probable rape, possible death. The propaganda had been very specific and very frightening about what American soldiers supposedly did to German women. The Atlantic crossing took weeks, sometimes more than a month depending on convoy schedules and submarine threats. Conditions on the ships varied enormously. Some were relatively humane, with adequate space and reasonable food. Others were severely overcrowded, with prisoners sleeping in shifts, seasickness endemic, sanitation barely adequate. But throughout the entire journey, there was pervasive, overwhelming fear. One young woman kept a diary during her crossing in July 1945. Her entries, discovered decades later in German archives, reveal her mental state. I cannot eat, not from seasickness, but from fear. What awaits us in America? Execution? Slave labor in mines or fields until we die? Sexual slavery? I try to pray, but the words die in my throat. Perhaps prayer is not meant for people like me, people who served evil, even if we didn't understand it was evil at the time. God must hate us. Why else would he abandon us to this fate? And then they arrived in America, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was as they expected. This is where the cognitive dissonance began. The first crack in the propaganda's edifice. They were fed. Not starvation rations, not the bare minimum to keep prisoners alive, but real food in substantial portions. After years of declining rations in Germany, where even military personnel were on reduced calories by 1944, this abundance was shocking. One woman later recalled, I thought they were fattening us up for some purpose. I couldn't believe they would simply feed us well out of basic decency. It seemed like a trick. They were given medical examinations, not brutal interrogations disguised as medicine, not invasive procedures meant to humiliate, but professional. Clinical examinations aimed at identifying and treating illnesses or injuries. Women who arrived sick or injured received actual medical treatment with real medicine. One woman, who had contracted tuberculosis in the chaos of Germany's collapse, was immediately quarantined and treated with antibiotics. She survived because of American medical care. They were issued clothing, clean uniforms to replace the filthy, worn-out garments they'd been wearing for months. New shoes, and this detail struck many women as almost surreal, because many hadn't had new shoes in years. In Germany by 1944, shoes were being manufactured with cardboard soles because leather was unavailable. Women had been wearing the same worn-out shoes, patched and repatched, until they literally fell apart. Getting new, sturdy American-made shoes felt like an impossible luxury. They were processed through bureaucratic systems that were impersonal but not cruel. American soldiers took their information, photographed them, fingerprinted them, assigned them prisoner numbers. It was all very organized, very efficient, very unemotional. No one screamed at them. No one beat them. No one sexually assaulted them. They were treated as administrative problems to be categorized and filed, not as hated enemies to be punished. And then they were loaded onto trains and sent to POW camps scattered across the American interior, to places they'd never heard of: Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, to a landscape utterly foreign to them, flat and enormous and completely untouched by war. And this is where their story really begins, where the paradox that would later shock American officers started to take root. Let me explain why the United States ended up holding nearly 500,000 German POWs on American soil. Because this wasn't obvious or inevitable or even particularly desired by American authorities. In 1942, as the United States was mobilizing for global war, Britain was running out of space and resources to hold the growing number of Axis prisoners being captured in North Africa and later in Italy. The British government sent a request to Washington. Can you take some of our prisoners? Can you house them in America, where we don't have to worry about them escaping back to Germany or being liberated by German forces? The U.S. government was initially very reluctant. There were multiple concerns that made American officials hesitant. Security concerns topped the list. What if German POWs included trained saboteurs or intelligence operatives who would escape and commit acts of terrorism on American soil? What if they organized resistance within the camps? What if they tried to recruit German Americans for fifth column activities? Then there was intense public opposition from American civilians. American families were sending their sons to die in Europe and the Pacific. The idea of German prisoners being housed in America, being fed with American food, being treated according to Geneva Convention standards that required humane treatment, it felt wrong to many Americans. It felt like coddling the enemy. Letters poured into Congress demanding that German prisoners be treated harshly, be put to hard labor, be made to suffer for the suffering Germany had caused. And there were enormous logistical concerns. Where do you put 500,000 prisoners? How do you guard them? How do you feed them? How do you prevent escapes? How do you maintain discipline? How do you prevent them from being attacked by angry American civilians? The United States had minimal experience with large-scale POW operations. In World War I, only about 2,000 German prisoners had been held in America. The infrastructure, the trained personnel, the administrative systems, none of it existed. But ultimately, hard pragmatism won out over ideological objections. Britain desperately needed help managing its prisoners. America had vast amounts of space, especially in rural areas far from strategic targets or coastlines. More importantly, America had a massive labor shortage that was becoming critical to the war effort. With millions of American men deployed overseas, with factories running at maximum capacity and farms struggling to harvest crops, the nation was desperately short of workers. German POWs could fill that gap, providing essential labor in agriculture and certain industries. And Geneva Convention rules, which the U.S. was committed to following, allowed prisoner labor under specific conditions. So the decision was made. America would accept Axis prisoners. The treatment of these prisoners was governed by international law, specifically the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States took these obligations seriously, more seriously than many other nations, for reasons both principled and practical. Key provisions of the Geneva Convention established clear rules. Prisoners must be housed in conditions equivalent to the captor nation's own troops. They must receive adequate food and medical care meeting minimum standards. They can be required to work, but not on direct war-related production like munitions or weapons. They must be paid for their labor at rates comparable to local workers. Officers cannot be compelled to work, though they can volunteer. Prisoners must have access to mail, though it can be censored. They must be allowed to practice their religion. They must be protected from violence and abuse. And crucially, prisoners must be repatriated to their home country after hostilities end. The United States mostly followed these rules carefully and consistently, far more so than many other combatant nations in World War II. There were multiple reasons for this compliance. First was reciprocity. Thousands of American soldiers were held as POWs by Germany, Japan, and Italy. The U.S. wanted those nations to treat American prisoners well, so American policy was to treat German prisoners well in hopes of reciprocal treatment. This didn't work with Japan, which routinely violated Geneva Convention standards and subjected American POWs to horrific conditions. But it did work reasonably well with Germany, which generally treated American and British POWs relatively decently, at least by wartime standards. Second was moral authority. The United States wanted to demonstrate democratic values and Western civilization's superiority versus Nazi barbarism and Japanese militarism. Treating prisoners humanely was part of that demonstration, part of proving that America fought for noble principles rather than mere power. Third was practical politics and military effectiveness. If word spread that American camps were brutal, it would make German soldiers less likely to surrender. Every German soldier who fought to the death, rather than surrendering, meant more American casualties. The U.S. wanted to encourage surrenders, wanted German soldiers to know that captivity in American hands meant survival and decent treatment. This was particularly important in 1944 and 1945 as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself. By 1945, the United States had created a massive infrastructure for holding and managing POWs. Over 700 POW facilities existed across the country, ranging from large permanent base camps that might hold several thousand prisoners to small branch camps on farms where 50 prisoners might work seasonally. The camps varied enormously in size, location, and specific conditions, but they all followed the same basic Geneva Convention framework. For the women prisoners, certain patterns emerged in their placement and treatment. They were housed in dedicated compounds physically separated from male prisoners, with separate barracks, mess halls, and facilities. They were predominantly sent to camps in rural agricultural areas where labor shortages were most acute: Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and similar states in America's agricultural heartland. They were kept in relatively smaller groups, usually 30 to 100 women, rather than the thousands of male prisoners in larger camps. This was partly for practical reasons related to available work, and partly because American authorities were uncertain how to handle female POWs and preferred to keep them in manageable numbers. Why specifically rural areas? Multiple factors drove this decision. Labor was desperately needed for agriculture, and the harvest season waited for no one. Escape would be difficult to impossible. Where would a German woman go in rural Kansas? How far could she get without speaking English, without money, without any knowledge of American geography? There was less public visibility in rural areas, avoiding political problems with urban populations who might be more hostile to German prisoners. And land was cheaper and more available for camp construction in rural areas compared to building near cities. Now let me describe in very specific detail what daily life was actually like for these women, because the concrete details matter enormously for understanding why they later feared repatriation. For accommodation, they lived in wooden barracks arranged in orderly rows within the fenced compound. Each woman had a single bunk with a mattress, not comfortable by any means, but adequate and certainly better than sleeping on floors or in cellars, as many German civilians were doing by 1944. The barracks had heating provided by coal or wood stoves, crucial for surviving winter months in places like Iowa or Kansas, where temperatures could drop below freezing. They had electric lighting, something many German civilians had lost, as power systems were destroyed by bombing. They had access to shared bathroom and shower facilities with hot running water, an almost unimaginable luxury in war-torn Germany. They had laundry facilities where they could wash their clothes regularly with actual soap. This was all basic, certainly. This was not luxury accommodation by any standard. But compare it carefully to conditions in Germany by 1944 to 1945, and the contrast becomes stark and undeniable. Millions of German civilians were homeless, living in cellars of bombed-out buildings or in makeshift shelters in parks and forests. Those who still had housing often lacked heat because coal supplies had been exhausted or couldn't be distributed through destroyed rail networks. They lacked electricity because power plants and distribution systems had been destroyed by Allied bombing. They lacked running water because water systems had been damaged. They lacked functioning sanitation because sewage systems had collapsed. They were living in conditions that were regressing toward medieval standards. The food situation provides the most stark and morally troubling contrast between life in the camps and life in Germany. Red Cross inspection reports meticulously documented POW meals, and these reports reveal an abundance that was shocking given the global context of wartime shortages. A typical day's meals for a German POW in America included, for breakfast, oatmeal or cold cereal with milk, eggs served 2 to 3 times per week, bread with real butter, not margarine, and coffee with milk and sugar, luxuries unavailable to most German civilians. For lunch, soup made with real meat stock, a portion of meat or fish, vegetables that were fresh or properly canned, bread, and sometimes dessert like canned fruit or pudding. For dinner, another serving of meat, which could be beef, chicken, or pork, depending on availability, potatoes or rice as a starch, more vegetables, additional bread, and occasionally fresh fruit when in season. The total daily caloric intake came to approximately 3,200 calories according to detailed Red Cross measurements, more than enough to maintain health and even gain weight. Now compare this to Germany in 1944 to 1945 and understand why these women would later fear returning to starvation. Official civilian rations in Berlin by late 1944 had been reduced to 1,412 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life and certainly insufficient for anyone doing physical labor. Actual available food, due to the complete collapse of distribution systems caused by Allied bombing of rail networks and roads, was often well under 1,000 calories per day. Many German civilians were literally starving to death, dying of malnutrition-related diseases, even if not direct starvation. The mortality rate among German civilians, particularly the elderly and children, spiked dramatically in 1945 and 1946. One woman wrote in a letter home that was intercepted by camp censors and preserved in military archives. "Mother, I am ashamed to tell you this, but I must speak truth even if it damns me. Yesterday I ate until I felt physically sick. Not from bad food, but from the sheer volume of good food. Real butter, not the ersatz substitute we had at the end. Meat twice in one day, Meat that was actually meat and not mixed with sawdust or mystery ingredients. White bread that was pure wheat, not the black bread mixed with chestnuts and acorns that we ate in the last year. I think of you eating nettle soup and dandelion greens that you forage from bomb craters, and I cry. I cry from guilt. I cry because I am eating better as a prisoner than you are eating as a free woman in your own country. This cannot be right. This cannot be just. But it is reality. Medical care in the camp infirmaries reveals another dimension of the paradox. Camp infirmaries were staffed with U.S. military doctors and nurses who treated prisoners according to the same standards as American soldiers. Prisoners received treatment for injuries and illnesses using modern medicine and proper procedures. They received dental care, something millions of German civilians had lost access to, as dentists were conscripted and dental supplies vanished. They received antibiotics, including the new wonder drug penicillin, that was generally unavailable in Germany by 1944. They received surgery when needed, performed by trained surgeons in sterile operating rooms. One woman who had shattered her leg during an Allied bombing raid of her communications center received reconstructive surgery in an American military hospital. The operation took several hours and involved multiple surgeons. The doctors used metal pins and plates to rebuild her leg, technology and techniques that simply weren't available in war-torn Germany. The surgery succeeded, saving her ability to walk normally. When she asked through a translator why they were doing this for her, why they were investing such effort in an enemy prisoner, the doctor, a captain from Ohio, replied with matter-of-fact American pragmatism, "You're a patient. That's all that matters right now. We took an oath to heal people, and that oath doesn't have exceptions for nationality or enemy status." This moment, this small interaction, would haunt her for decades. Years later, in an oral history interview conducted in the 1980s, she said, "Why did they do this? I was the enemy. My country had started the war that killed Americans, that killed perhaps someone that doctor knew. But he treated me like I was his own soldier, like I mattered as a human being. I don't understand it even now, but I never forgot it." Under Geneva Convention rules that the United States took seriously, prisoners could be assigned to labor with specific restrictions carefully outlined. Maximum 8-hour workday with no exceptions, ensuring prisoners weren't worked to exhaustion or death like happened in Axis labor camps. One rest day per week, usually Sunday, allowing for physical recovery and religious observance. No dangerous work that could result in death or serious injury, so no mine work, no explosive handling, no combat zone labor, no direct war production, meaning no work manufacturing munitions, weapons, military vehicles, or anything directly used to kill enemy soldiers. Payment required at minimum rates, usually about 80 cents per day, which was paid in camp scrip that could be used in the camp commissary. Small, but something that gave prisoners a degree of economic agency. For the women prisoners, work assignments typically fell into several categories that made use of their labor without violating Geneva Convention restrictions. Agricultural labor formed the largest category, with women working in fields across the Midwest and South. Sugar beet harvesting in Kansas and Nebraska was back-breaking work, bending over rows of beets for hours in the summer heat, pulling them from hard soil, loading them into trucks. Cotton picking in Texas and Oklahoma meant working in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, filling heavy bags that left their hands raw. Fruit and vegetable picking in California meant working on ladders in orchards or stooping in vegetable fields. Corn harvesting in Iowa during the late summer and fall meant dealing with corn leaves that cut skin and corn dust that got into everything. Camp maintenance work employed many women in less physically demanding but still essential roles. Kitchen work meant preparing meals for hundreds of people, washing enormous quantities of dishes, managing food storage and distribution. Laundry services meant washing, drying, ironing, and mending clothing for the entire camp population. Administrative tasks included maintaining prisoner records, translating documents, managing the camp library, helping with mail censorship by translating German letters. Gardening and grounds maintenance meant growing vegetables for camp consumption and keeping the campgrounds orderly. Some women also worked in food processing operations that were located near camps. Canneries employed prisoners during harvest season to process fruits and vegetables, work that was tedious and repetitive, but not particularly difficult. Packaging operations prepared foods for shipment to military and civilian markets. The work was hard. Absolutely no question about that. 8-hour days in agricultural fields under the prairie sun was physically demanding, especially for women who had come from office or technical positions and weren't accustomed to manual labor. But the work also had qualities that made it psychologically bearable and even sometimes satisfying. It was consistent and predictable, not the chaos and terror of retreating through war zones with bombs falling and artillery fire approaching. It was safe in the sense that no one was actively trying to kill you while you worked, unlike anti-aircraft positions under Allied bombing attacks. It was productive with visible results. You could see the corn you'd harvested, the beets you'd pulled, the meals you'd prepared, giving a sense of accomplishment. And it was part of a stable routine. You woke at the same time, ate at regular intervals, worked during defined hours, had leisure time in the evening, creating psychological stability that was absent from the chaos of wartime Germany. This is where the story becomes really interesting from a sociological and psychological perspective. What happened when German women prisoners worked alongside American civilians who had to interact with them daily? Initially, many American farmers and townspeople were hostile or, at minimum, deeply uncomfortable with the situation. These were Germans, enemies, representatives of the nation that had allied with Japan to attack America, that had declared war and forced America into a global conflict. Some American families had sons or husbands serving overseas in Europe or the Pacific, fighting against German forces. The idea of German prisoners on American soil, being treated according to Geneva Convention standards, eating American food, working American farms, it felt profoundly wrong to many people. It felt like betrayal of American boys who were dying to defeat Germany. It felt like coddling the enemy, showing mercy to people who deserved none. Some newspapers published angry editorials. Some radio commentators denounced the policy. Letters poured into congressional offices demanding harsher treatment. But proximity and daily interaction changed many minds in ways that abstract policy debates never could. Farmers who initially resented having German prisoners assigned to their farms began to see these women as individuals rather than abstractions. They saw them work hard without complaint, despite difficult conditions. They saw them laugh together during breaks, sharing jokes in German that the farmers couldn't understand but could recognize as normal human interaction. They saw them sing songs while working, folk melodies that sounded foreign but conveyed universal emotions. They saw them receive letters from home and cry over devastating news about family deaths or destroyed homes. They saw them as daughters, sisters, mothers, as human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control. One farmer named Peterson in rural Kansas later gave an oral history interview where he recalled his changing attitude. At first, I resented them deeply. My son James was fighting in France, pushing toward Germany. Every day I worried I'd get a telegram saying he'd been killed. And here I had German women working my land, women whose countrymen were shooting at my boy. It felt wrong. But I needed the labor, or my crops would rot in the fields and I'd lose everything. So I agreed when the army offered to send prisoners, Peterson continued. The first day, a guard brought 6 German women to my farm at dawn. They looked scared, which surprised me. I expected defiance or arrogance. They looked like frightened kids. Young, most of them couldn't have been older than my daughter Sarah. They worked hard all day. Didn't complain even when the heat got brutal. Didn't cause any trouble. At lunch, my wife Margaret had put out a pitcher of cold water for them and some sandwiches. One of them, Anna was her name I learned later, she spoke some broken English. She saw a photo, of James in his uniform that Margaret kept in the lunch basket. Anna looked at it, looked at Margaret, and said very carefully, choosing each word, "Your son is brave soldier. My brother is soldier too, in Russia, we think. We don't know if he is alive." Margaret just broke down crying right there. Anna started crying too. They stood there, enemy women on opposite sides of the war, hugging each other and crying. And I realized something that changed how I saw everything. These were just kids, caught in something bigger than themselves. They didn't start the war. They didn't choose the war. They were swept up in it, just like my son was. The American soldiers assigned to guard duty at POW camps formed another complex layer of human interaction that defied simple narratives. These guards were usually men deemed unsuitable for combat deployment for various reasons. Too young, 17-year-olds who hadn't reached 18 yet and couldn't be sent into combat legally. Too old, men over 35 who were considered past optimal combat age. Medically disqualified from combat deployment due to conditions like asthma, poor eyesight, minor heart problems, or old injuries. Psychologically unsuitable for combat based on evaluation that suggested they wouldn't function well under fire. This created interesting and sometimes awkward dynamics between guards and prisoners. Many guards were teenagers themselves, barely older than some of the women they were guarding, sometimes even younger than the older prisoners. They were boys thrust into a role that required authority they didn't quite feel they possessed. Others were fathers with daughters at home, men who saw these young German women and couldn't help but think of their own girls. Professional distance was supposed to be strictly maintained. Fraternization with prisoners was explicitly forbidden in military regulations. Guards who were caught having romantic or even friendly relationships with prisoners could face serious consequences, including court-martial. But small acts of kindness happened constantly despite regulations. Because humanity kept breaking through the official barriers, guards would share their cigarette rations with prisoners who had nothing. They'd bring extra food from the guards' mess hall, passing cookies or fruit to prisoners when no one was watching. They'd teach English words and phrases, helping women learn the language that might help them survive. They'd look the other way when minor rules were bent, like when prisoners stayed up past official lights out singing songs, or when they traded items among themselves. These acts mattered enormously to the women. For people who had been dehumanized by propaganda, by war, by their status as defeated enemies, being treated as individuals with dignity was psychologically crucial to maintaining any sense of self-worth. After work ended, during the free hours before lights out, the camps came alive in unexpected and poignant ways. Somehow, despite the chaos of capture and transport, a few women had managed to keep or acquire musical instruments. An accordion appeared in one camp, carried across the Atlantic by a woman who'd somehow convinced guards it was harmless. A harmonica materialized in another. Someone with woodworking skills fashioned a crude flute from a piece of wood, using a knife and patience. German folk songs filled the prairie air on summer evenings, melodies that had been sung for generations. So, Lily Marlene was a particular favorite. That haunting song about a soldier saying goodbye to his sweetheart under a lamppost, a song that had been beloved by soldiers on both sides of the war, because its emotions transcended national boundaries. American guards would pause in their patrols to listen to this music. One young guard later wrote in a letter home that his family preserved, "I couldn't understand the words they were singing, but I understood the emotion perfectly. Longing, loss, hope mixed with sadness. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. I stood there in the darkness listening, and I forgot for a moment that they were supposed to be the enemy. They were just people far from home, singing about missing the people and places they loved. Some women drew or painted using whatever scraps of materials they could find or trade for. They sketched the prairie landscapes that were so dramatically different from European geography, those endless flat horizons that seemed to go on forever. They drew portraits of each other, capturing faces and expressions in charcoal or pencil. They created small artworks that helped them process their experiences and maintain some sense of creative identity. Women taught each other skills during these evening hours, sharing knowledge that might prove useful. English lessons were common, with women who spoke some English teaching others basic vocabulary and phrases. One woman who had worked as a seamstress before the war taught others how to repair and alter clothing, skills that would be crucial when they returned to Germany, where new clothing would be impossible to obtain. Women who knew typing taught others, thinking ahead to potential employment in occupied Germany. Despite being prisoners, despite the barbed wire and guards and restrictions on movement, they formed genuine communities with bonds that sometimes lasted decades after the war. They celebrated birthdays together, pooling saved rations and small luxuries from the commissary to create makeshift parties. They comforted each other during mail call when devastating news arrived from home. They shared resources, giving extra food to women who were sick, sharing clothing with those whose garments wore out. They looked out for each other's mental health, recognizing signs of depression or despair, and intervening with companionship and support. Here's what's psychologically fascinating about their experience, what reveals something profound about human adaptation to circumstances. These women underwent a gradual cognitive shift in how they perceived their situation. Initially, predictably, they viewed the camp as a prison, a place of confinement and loss of freedom, a punishment for their nation's defeat. The barbed wire symbolized captivity. The guards represented enemy oppression. The restrictions felt like violations of their autonomy and dignity, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the camps began to take on different meanings in their minds. The barbed wire that initially symbolized captivity began to symbolize safety, protection from the chaos and violence that was consuming Europe. The guards who represented enemy oppression began to represent protection, men who ironically were keeping them safe from worse fates. The routine that felt restrictive began to feel stabilizing, providing the psychological structure that humans need to function. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome in the clinical sense, which involves developing affection or loyalty toward captors. This was something different, more rational, more pragmatic. This was conscious recognition that their current situation, while not ideal, was substantially better than the realistic alternatives they faced. The camp provided multiple layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Physiological needs were met through regular meals, clean water, adequate shelter. Safety needs were met through protection from violence, predictable environment, security of knowing each day would be similar to the last. Social needs were met through community with other women who shared similar experiences and could provide mutual support. Meanwhile, Germany provided none of these things. Germany was chaos, starvation, violence, uncertainty. So gradually the camp became home in a way that Germany no longer could be. And this is why the announcement of repatriation would create such panic, such desperate pleas to remain. They weren't insane. They were rational people recognizing that what the Americans called liberation was actually abandonment to catastrophe. Throughout their captivity, prisoners were allowed to send and receive mail, a right guaranteed by the Geneva Convention that the United States generally honored. But the mail system had significant limitations and complications. All mail was heavily censored, with military personnel reading every letter to ensure no intelligence information was being transmitted. Mail was severely delayed, often taking 6 to 8 weeks to travel between Germany and America in each direction, sometimes longer if submarines disrupted Atlantic shipping. Mail was unreliable, with many letters never arriving due to the chaos of war. Destroyed ships, bombed postal facilities, or simple bureaucratic failure. Mail call became the most emotionally intense moment of each week in the camps. Women would gather anxiously, hoping desperately to hear their prisoner number called, to receive some word from home, some confirmation that family members still lived. Those who received letters often cried whether the news was good or devastating. Those who received nothing felt a different kind of anguish, the torture of not knowing, wondering if silence meant death or just postal failure. The letters that did arrive painted an increasingly dark and terrifying picture of conditions in Germany that made the women's later pleas to remain prisoners completely rational and understandable. Let me share some actual excerpts from letters, translated from German, that were preserved in declassified military archives because censors made copies of particularly significant correspondence. These are real words from real people describing real horror, and they explain everything about why these women would later beg not to be freed.